What if the man they crucified never died? What if he returned, not to forgive, but to judge? Why did the fields rot after his death? And why, a year later, did the congregation begin to disappear? One by one, they tried to silence a slave who preached freedom. But some sermons echo louder from the grave. Have you ever heard of the preacher they nailed to a cross in 1836, and the curse that followed? You're about to. In the sweltering dark of Louisiana's summer nights, long after the overseers had vanished into drink and slumber, a quiet procession stirred beneath the cypress trees. Bare feet padded silently over cracked soil and pine needles, the only sound a rustle like whispers through sugarcane. They moved with the precision of ritual, but none carried torches. Light was dangerous, so they came in darkness, and they came with reverence. At the edge of the Harrow plantation, where the land sloped down into the woods, an abandoned mule barn stood leaning against its own ruin. There, in the hollow of that broken shell, slaves from surrounding plantations gathered in secret. Some walked for hours, some limped from beatings barely scabbed over. But they came, not for food, nor shelter, nor stolen sleep, but for him, Ezekiel. He stood barefoot in the center of the barn, silhouetted against a single stub of tallow candle. He wore no robe, no cross, no sign of authority save for his voice, deep, slow, deliberate. He read from a Bible smuggled and half-burned, bound in rag and twine, its pages worn from sweat and soil. Yet his voice gave the words a fire they had never held in the mouths of white preachers. Pharaoh's heart was hardened, he said, but God still broke his grip. And when the sea opened, the captives walked through on dry ground. A murmur passed through the gathered crowd. Some wept quietly, others gripped the hands of their children. Ezekiel closed the book and looked into them, not over them. You are not livestock. You are not cursed. That lie has lasted too long. We are not Cain, we are Moses. He spoke of freedom, not just in the next world, but in this one. He named the chains and called them sin. He named the lash and called it blasphemy. He named the masters and called them pharaohs. Such talk was a noose spun in real time. By day, Ezekiel labored in the tobacco fields like any other. He spoke little, bore his scars in silence. To the white eyes that watched him, he was slow, compliant, nearly mute. But by night, he became something else entirely, a vessel of defiance wrapped in scripture. He never cursed the masters by name, never called for blood, only truth. That was enough, and the truth began to travel. Word of Ezekiel's sermons spread from one plantation to the next, carried in hushed breath during water breaks, in songs sung just above a whisper. They called him the tongue, or the candle. Some said he could heal a fever with a prayer. Others swore his voice made dogs bark and horses rear up. But Ezekiel dismissed the stories. He was not magic. He was not Christ. He was simply tired of silence. One night, a woman named Mary came limping into the barn, her face swollen and her hands shaking. Her daughter had been taken that morning, sold without warning. Ezekiel stopped his sermon and walked to her. He placed his hand upon her head and spoke not in English, but in an old tongue, half Hebrew, half Gullah, a sound that echoed in the ribcage like thunder. She fell to her knees and wept until she slept. That was the night someone betrayed him. No one knew who. Perhaps a jealous stable boy, perhaps a slave too broken to risk another beating, or perhaps one of the masters had come disguised, crouched outside the barn, listening to every forbidden syllable. What is certain is this. Within a week, Reverend Josiah Harrow summoned his overseers at dawn. He held in his hand a torn page from a Bible, and upon it, Ezekiel's name was written in charcoal. The page smelled of smoke and sweat, and so the order was given. Ezekiel was to be made an example, not whipped, not hanged, something older, something crueler, something divine. The barn was razed that very morning, the ashes left to mix with the hoof mud. Mary disappeared that night. Others were beaten until their bones broke, but Ezekiel they did not kill in secret. For him, the Reverend planned a sermon of his own, a spectacle, a holy warning, and the cross was already being built. Reverend Josiah Harrow had long considered himself a shepherd in a land of beasts. He believed the whip was not only a tool of discipline, but of divine instruction. In his sermons, he spoke not of salvation, but of order, hierarchy, and obedience. The pulpit was his throne, and the Bible his weapon, bludgeoned into the minds of the submissive. He preached in a voice like firewood cracking in winter, all brimstone and certainty. He did not fear rebellion. He feared ideas. When whispers of Ezekiel's sermons reached him, stories of a slave quoting scripture against the masters, of a man likening himself to Moses, Harrow's fury was not immediate. It was cold, ceremonial. He took to fasting. For 3 days, he walked the edges of his estate, muttering psalms under his breath, clutching the spine of his Bible as though it were a blade. Then, on the 4th day, he emerged with a plan. "A shepherd must break the leg of the lamb that strays," he said, "so it learns to stay close." He summoned his congregation to the churchyard, not for a sermon, for a reckoning. Overseers rode out to collect Ezekiel at dusk. They found him kneeling alone in the field, praying into the wind, his hands stained with soil. He did not resist. When they bound his wrists, he looked each man in the eye, not with defiance, but with a sorrow that unnerved them. The cross had already been built, 12 feet high, fashioned from stripped pine, its edges sanded smooth like an altar. Harrow insisted it be perfect, not like the crude gallows used for thieves and drunks. No, this was a holy instrument. The straight cross, he called it, a righteous design. The next morning, with the town assembled in their Sunday best, Ezekiel was led barefoot to the center of the churchyard. Children were made to watch. Slaves were dragged from their cabins and ordered to kneel. Harrow climbed the pulpit, not to preach, but to preside. "They say he speaks for God," Harrow boomed. "Let him now speak from the cross." Ezekiel was lifted onto the structure, his arms stretched along the beam. No nails, only thick, rusted spikes driven through bone and knotted wood. His mouth was gagged with linen soaked in vinegar. Blood darkened the pine. Some say the sky dimmed, though no clouds passed overhead. The crucifixion lasted hours. Harrow read from the book of Romans. He denounced false prophets. He reminded the crowd that rebellion was as the sin of witchcraft. He spoke until his throat cracked and the congregation wept, not for Ezekiel, but from the sheer force of Harrow's conviction, but not everyone looked away. Among the slaves, there were eyes locked not on Harrow, but on the man suspended in silence. They watched the way his fingers curled, the way his chest still heaved, slow but steady. They watched as flies gathered, then scattered, and as the sun dipped low, painting the blood in amber. Some claimed to see his gaze lift, not in agony, but in warning. By dusk, the crowd had gone. Only the overseers remained. Harrow gave the order, "Leave him there. Let his body hang as testament. Let the wolves come. Let the crows finish the sermon." But when they returned at dawn, the cross stood empty. No blood trail, no broken ropes, only a small scorch mark at the base of the wood, as though lightning had kissed the earth in silence. And from that day forward, none who had watched him die would ever sleep soundly again. The night air that followed Ezekiel's execution clung to the plantation like a second skin, thick with silence, the kind of silence that tastes like copper and waits like judgment. Nothing stirred in the trees, no frogs sang in the ditches. Even the dogs, usually howling into the dark for no reason at all, held their tongues. The cross still stood in the churchyard, soaked in dried blood, casting a long shadow under the moonlight. Ezekiel's body, lifeless and limp just hours before, had been left to rot as ordered. His limbs tied tight, his head slumped forward. But by morning, the ropes hung loose and empty. At first, the overseers thought it a prank. Perhaps some daring slave cut him down under cover of night, buried him in the forest. They searched the grounds. They questioned the house hands. They beat the field workers bloody. No one confessed. No one had seen a thing. Then they checked the soil beneath the cross. There were no drag marks, no prints, no signs of a body removed. Only one thing remained, the linen gag, stiff with dried spit, resting neatly at the foot of the post, folded. Word of his vanishing traveled quickly, faster even than the tale of his death. Some said he had been taken by angels. Others whispered that he had not died at all, that he had endured something no man was meant to survive. A woman from a neighboring plantation claimed she saw a figure moving through the cane fields that dawn, limping, wrapped in rags, one arm nailed to his chest with cloth. She said his eyes glowed in the dark like furnace coals. The Reverend Harrow dismissed it all as hysteria. He declared it blasphemy to speak Ezekiel's name. He ordered every copy of the slave's Bible sermons burned, but the fire only fed the legend. The more he tried to erase Ezekiel, the more his memory rooted itself in the soil, in the minds of the broken, in the mouths of those too bruised to speak aloud. Children began waking at night, saying they heard singing from the woods. Strange hymns in no known tongue, words made of wind and ash. Some claimed to see crosses carved into trees, upside down, wrapped in vines. A preacher visiting from Baton Rouge found a small bundle left at the altar after service, a twig cross tied with human hair, smeared with what he thought was rust, until he smelled it. Slaves across the region began to refuse certain tasks, refused to step near the church, refused to harvest cane from fields closest to the crucifixion site. One man, caught praying at the spot where the body had vanished, was whipped until his back split. Before he lost consciousness, he muttered the same phrase over and over. "He's not gone, just walking." Harrow grew nervous. He ordered nightly patrols. Armed guards rode the borders of his land, lanterns swinging from their saddles, and yet, each morning, they returned shaken, spoke of strange footprints that stopped mid-step, trees stripped bare in perfect spirals. Once, they found a deer strung up in mimicry of the cross, its tongue nailed to its chest, eyes wide open, staring at nothing. No one dared say it aloud, but fear had changed its shape. They had tried to kill a man. What they had made instead was something else. Summer passed with no harvest. The cane turned brittle. The tobacco leaves shriveled before the cutting. The ground, once fertile under Harrow's dominion, soured beneath the weight of something unseen. No amount of irrigation, no ritual blessing, no whipping of hands could bring life back to the fields. It was as if the land itself had recoiled in quiet rebellion. In the parish records, the season was marked as unusually dry. But those who lived beneath the scorched sky knew better. The drought had not begun with the heat. It began the morning Ezekiel vanished. Harrow doubled the sermons, sharpened his doctrine. He took to quoting Deuteronomy with violent precision, invoking curses upon all who doubted the divine chain of master and slave. He renamed the church Sanctum of Obedience. New placards were nailed to the chapel gates. New rules were issued. Any gathering of more than 3 slaves, even in prayer, was now deemed a subversive act. They were told to whisper no more, yet silence only deepened their resolve. In the cabins, children began reciting verses not taught by their overseers, variations of scripture, twisted back into truth. "The meek shall rise," one boy muttered in his sleep, "and the blood shall mark their doorposts." A girl, no more than 7, scratched symbols into the dirt behind the smokehouse, crosses bound in twine, encircled with thorns. Soon after, the dreams began. Across the plantations, men and women awoke drenched in sweat, their hands raw, their throats hoarse from chanting in their sleep. They dreamed of a man walking barefoot through ash, his eyes veiled in linen, his body stitched with shadow. His voice came not from his mouth, but from the earth beneath them, speaking in rhythms that echoed bones breaking. Some woke to find their feet caked in mud, though they had never left their beds. The masters noticed. Harrow's niece, a girl of 14, began screaming at dusk, said she saw someone standing outside her window, staring up at her, arms outstretched, nailed to nothing. Her screams stopped the moment her mouth filled with blood, though no wound could be found. The following day, she was sent away to an asylum in Georgia. She would not speak again. Animals refused to enter the churchyard. Birds, once nesting in the eaves, vanished. Chickens laid misshapen eggs, soft and red like bruises. The bell, rung each Sunday without fail, cracked down the center. Harrow had it removed, but the sound returned, low, dull, heard only at night, as if rung beneath the ground. One afternoon, in full daylight, the cross upon which Ezekiel had been hung was found uprooted, not broken, not torn down by storm or man, but lifted clean from the soil, its base blackened, the wood warped as though something had burned from within. No one claimed to have touched it. Harrow ordered it hidden, buried behind the chapel. That night, it reappeared on the hill overlooking the fields, standing upright, untouched by dirt. By then, even Harrow's most loyal followers had begun to falter. They looked to him not with reverence, but with hesitation. Whispers began among the white families, of curses, of judgment, of a sin not buried but crucified and left to walk. When a storm finally came, it brought no rain, only wind and dust and thunder that cracked like shouted names. Trees split down the center, windows shattered, and in the distance, those who dared look out into the night swore they saw him, limping through the cane, his arms still stretched wide, his mouth covered in linen. Behind him, the sound of chains dragging, not in burden, but in rhythm. Those who had watched him crucified now kept candles burning through the night, not for salvation, but for forgiveness that would never come. It began with the nails, thin, blackened iron, too old to be fresh, too sharp to be rusted. They appeared without pattern, one on a doorstep, another wedged into the seam of a Bible, a third embedded in the wood of a sleeping child's cradle. Always placed with care, never thrown, never random. They bore no inscription, yet every heart that found them knew the message they carried. Something once sealed was now undone. A year had passed since Ezekiel vanished from the cross. Most had convinced themselves it had ended, that whatever spirit had been stirred by his death had burned itself out, like old coals finally cold. The stories dulled, the field songs returned to sorrow instead of warning. But then came the first sermon, not spoken from a pulpit, not written on paper. It came in the form of a body. Ezekiel Brantley, an elder slave who had once served as a driver under Harrow, was found at sunrise, suspended against the outer wall of the chapel, his arms stretched in mockery of the crucifixion, his lips stitched shut with horsehair. In his chest, driven deep through his sternum, was a nail identical to the ones found earlier. No blood, no struggle. Only a note carved into the wood beside his head, the word returns. Harrow claimed it was the work of vagrants, runaways perhaps, trying to stir unrest. He ordered his congregation to remain vigilant, to report any strange gatherings, to burn any object found marked with twine or cross. But fear had already begun to stain the air. Others soon followed. Rebecca Cullen, the wife of a deacon who had laughed at Ezekiel's preaching, was found seated upright in her parlor, her eyes wide, her hands nailed palm down to her own dining table. Around her neck, a rosary soaked in something foul and sour. No one heard her scream. A child claimed he saw a man walking the road near the swamp at dusk, barefoot, arms stiff and out, with something dragging behind him that clinked and rattled. The child was beaten for spreading stories, but when he refused to recant, they locked him in the church basement. He never stopped singing, 3 nights straight. Psalms no one had taught him. The churches emptied. Not officially, attendance was still expected. But people arrived late and left early. They sat in silence. They kept their children close and their eyes fixed on the floor. The hymns rang hollow. The communion wine soured on the tongue. No one dared confess what they feared, but it hung over every service. They had not buried a man. They had provoked a reckoning. Then came the marks. On the anniversary of the crucifixion, every door of every family who had attended Ezekiel's execution was found pierced with 3 nails, arranged in the shape of a cross. On each threshold, a smear of ash, no prints, no witnesses, just the markings and the silence that followed. Slaves began to disappear, not fleeing toward freedom, but vanishing into the woods without a word. Some left behind bundles of cloth, twisted into human forms. Others carved symbols into the bark of trees, serpents with eyes like flames, men walking into fire. The masters doubled their patrols, but no tracks could be followed. The forest refused to speak. Harrow prayed. For the first time in decades, he did so not in command, but in desperation. He locked himself inside the chapel for 3 days, fasting, reading scripture aloud until his throat split. On the 3rd night, the crucifix above the altar fell and shattered at his feet. The nails rolled to a stop beside his knees, and in the distance, carried by the wind through pine and cane, came a sound not heard since the barn, a voice low and steady, not sung but delivered, as if from within the ribs of the earth. The preacher had returned. But this time, he came not to speak, he came to gather. The letters came in silence. No courier, no horse, no footprints left behind, just slips of paper, creased, smudged, and stained with wax the color of dried blood, found beneath pillows, hidden in firewood stacks, folded into the sleeves of work coats, written in a hand both jagged and precise, as though the pen had been dragged by a hand long unfamiliar with softness. Each letter bore no greeting, no signature, only scripture, but not the kind found in the white man's Bible. They were fragments, twisted parables, mirrored psalms, a gospel reversed, not preaching forgiveness, but remembrance, not promising heaven, but awakening. To the slaves, they were familiar. They carried the cadence of Ezekiel's sermons, those whispered nights beneath the barn roof, when the world had paused to listen. Lines like, "Let the chain bear witness to the hand that forged it," or "The lamb does not forget the teeth." Some called it the Book of Ash. In truth, it was not a book at all. It was a movement stitched into paper, scattered like seeds. Each letter carried instructions, never commands, always suggestions: where to meet, what to watch, names, coordinates marked by broken fences or trees scarred with 3 vertical cuts. Those who received them never admitted it aloud, yet all began to act in quiet unison, as if led by one voice across many bodies. The white folk thought the fields had grown calm, that the hauntings had passed, but the silence now was not fear, it was rehearsal. And then the vengeance began, not open, not bloody, but surgical. Firewood rotted from the inside, chickens laid eggs filled with salt, the wells tasted of iron. Crops withered only on the parcels owned by those who had stood at Ezekiel's crucifixion. A merchant's ox turned on him in the road and crushed his legs. A judge found his youngest son speaking fluent Hebrew one morning, though the boy had never been taught a word. And always, before each occurrence, a letter. Even among the slaves, fear turned into awe. Ezekiel was no longer a martyr. He had become something deeper, a law, an embodiment of justice older than any scripture. They began to gather in places untouched by the Master's feet, sunken groves, hollowed trees, the mouths of caves, not to worship, but to remember. They built no shrines. Instead, they buried wooden nails beneath their floorboards. They sang old hymns backward, notes bending like smoke. They carved scripture into bone. Among the white men, paranoia blossomed. Harrow's overseers rode nightly patrols with rifles and lanterns, but they always returned pale, shaken, eyes bloodshot, lips dry with unspoken terror. One man cut off his own ears, saying he could no longer bear the sound of the sermons underground. Another hanged himself with his own whip, leaving behind a note made entirely of scripture, except every letter was burned into the paper as though scorched by a brand. Still, Harrow refused to yield. He summoned neighboring pastors. They performed rites. They poured holy oil along the property lines, but each morning the oil was gone, and in its place, symbols scratched deep into the thresholds of their homes, 3 nails, an inverted crown, and beneath it, a single word: remember. Even his congregation began to slip away. They didn't say why. They simply stopped showing up. They kept their lamps lit all night. Some began to mutter lines from the Book of Ash under their breath, half in fear, half in reverence. And when Harrow confronted one man, demanding to know what sorcery had overtaken them, the man replied, "You cannot kill a voice once it's made into echo." In the cane fields, they said you could hear footsteps now, slow, heavy, accompanied by the sound of chains dragging, but only when you stood still, only when you were alone. The word had outlived the man, and it had begun to write itself into the bones of those who listened. By the winter of the 2nd year, the town was a husk. The markets thinned, the bells rusted. Even the dogs, once fierce and ever barking, slunk through the streets with tails between their legs. Children no longer played near the chapel. Doors were barred at sundown. The very air felt brittle, as if the land itself held its breath. Reverend Harrow remained. He moved slower now. His hands shook when he held the Bible. He spoke less of God and more of duty, clinging to doctrine like a man clinging to a raft in rising water. He had grown gaunt, consumed not by illness, but by the long erosion of certainty. And yet, he planned a final service. He called it the Vigil of Obedience, a gathering to reclaim the spirit of this congregation and drive out the heresy festering among the weak. Invitations were hand-delivered by Harrow himself. No one dared refuse. On the appointed night, they came, what few remained, faces pale, eyes sunken, families clutched together on the chapel benches like passengers on a sinking ship. The church was sealed from within. Harrow ordered the doors barred, the windows shuttered. "No soul leaves until the Lord has spoken," he declared, voice hoarse from disuse. Candles were lit, hymns were sung without harmony. The walls, once white, had yellowed with mold and smoke, and the crucifix above the altar sagged under its own weight. Harrow read aloud from Exodus, from Leviticus, from Judges. His voice cracked on every third word, but the scripture no longer fell like thunder. It landed with the weight of dust. Then the first candle went out. No draught, no breath, just snuffed, as if by an unseen hand. A moment later, a second, then a third. Some cried out. Others whispered prayers in tongues never spoken in that church. The temperature dropped, not like a winter chill, but like something had opened from beneath the floorboards, a cold that tasted of grave soil and metal. From the rafters came a sound, not footsteps, not wind, but rhythm, a soft, pulsing thud, like a heartbeat slowed to near death. Then came the creak of ropes, the groan of timber bearing weight. Some looked up, most did not. A girl screamed. She pointed to the altar. The crucifix had vanished. In its place stood a figure, arms wide, face hidden beneath a veil of burlap and dried thorns. Chains coiled down from its shoulders, dragging across the stone. Its chest bore the imprint of nails, and though no mouth was visible, a voice rose, low, guttural, and distant, as if echoing through the ribs of the dead. "This is the true body." Panic broke. The congregation surged toward the doors, but they would not open. The windows would not shatter. Harrow stood frozen at the pulpit, eyes fixed, mouth ajar. The figure did not move, yet its shadow spread, long and branching, stretching across every pew like arms, reaching for the pass. One by one, they fell, not slain, not burned, not torn apart, but stilled, locked in place, their limbs seizing as if caught mid-prayer. Each pair of eyes wide, each throat sealed with silence. Only Harrow remained standing. He stepped down from the pulpit, knees buckling. He crawled toward the figure at the altar, dragging his Bible behind him. "Please," he whispered, "please let this pass." The figure tilted its head. From beneath the veil, something glinted, metal or bone, no one could say. Then it raised its arm. 3 nails floated between its fingers. The last thing Harrow saw was the flash of the iron, then darkness, then nothing. When morning came, the chapel stood untouched, doors ajar, candles burned to the wick. But inside, every pew sat filled with the congregation, silent, unmoving, arms outstretched, eyes open, mouths sealed with black thread. The altar was bare. Only a single nail remained, driven deep into the pulpit, with a scrap of parchment fluttering beside it. On it, one line: "The sermon is not over." Long after the final service, the town ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. The church doors remained shut. The fields were left to overgrow. Families packed what they could and fled north, west, anywhere their fear could not follow. But the name Ezekiel stayed. It was never spoken aloud. It lingered only in thought, in the weight that settled over the land like mildew on old wood. They had thought it finished. They believed a man, no matter how holy or haunted, could not return twice, that the vengeance had run its course, that whatever power had been summoned that night in the chapel had spent itself in fire and silence. But the truth was deeper, older, far more unsettling. Ezekiel had never been a singular flame. He was a spark struck in a drought, and sparks spread. In towns neighboring Willow Creek, new stories began to surface. of sermons whispered from within dry wells, of figures seen walking the tree lines in the fog, each bearing a different gait, a different wound, a different scar, but always the same eyes, dull, fixed, knowing. A farmer claimed he found one standing in his field before dawn, arms held wide, head bowed, breathing steam into the frost. When he approached, the figure dropped a nail into the soil and vanished without a step. Slaves began to disappear again, not in chains, but in silence. Not toward freedom, but toward something else. They left behind bundles wrapped in cloth, inscribed with letters no one could translate. Some were found weeks later in distant towns, their eyes clouded, their voices low and hypnotic, repeating phrases from a gospel that had never been printed. Those who dared listen swore the words twisted in the ear. Not lies, not madness, but truths spoken from beneath memory. A preacher in Mississippi tried to record one such recitation. He wrote 3 pages before setting his own house on fire and vanishing into the river. The message spread. It was not passed by books or ink, but in rhythm, in breath, in gaze, a kind of possession that did not consume the flesh, but rewrote its purpose. One woman, once mute from birth, was seen standing at the edge of a plantation in Georgia. She spoke a single sentence to the overseer. "He walks ahead of us now." Then she turned and walked into the woods, never to be seen again. From Louisiana to the Carolinas, sightings multiplied, each one slightly different, some cloaked in burlap, others barefoot, clothed in burial cloth, skin marked with scripture. One appeared with no face at all, just smooth skin where features should be, but still it watched. These were not ghosts. They did not drift or moan or haunt. They moved with intention, with memory, with mission. The old slaves began to say the name again, not as a man, but as a title. The Ezekiels, the first was the preacher, the crucified, the awakened. But now there were many, and they came not to speak, they came to reckon. Each figure carried some echo of the original pain, a scar where a nail had been, a voice choked as if still gagged, fingers curled into fists that never opened. And with each appearance, something changed. A master lost his voice, a chapel burned from the inside, a plantation house found empty, every door nailed shut from the inside. And still, no one could explain how they traveled, how they knew, how they chose. The slaves who followed them did not speak of freedom in the old sense. They no longer sought the North Star or the safe house or the river crossing. They sought hollow ground, places untouched by Scripture, where the blood had cooled but the memory still trembled. There they gathered, not in worship, but in preparation. For what? No one dared ask. But in the deep woods of the South, there are still places where no birds sing, where trees grow in perfect rings, and where, if you stand still long enough, you may hear it. The clink of chains dragged not in burden, but in rhythm. And then the breath behind you. And then the voice, not loud, not angry, but steady, familiar. And the question it always asks, did you watch him hang? It was not written all at once. It appeared in fragments, scraps of parchment, bone, bark, and leather, some sewn together with sinew, others bound with rusted nails or braided hair. It bore no author, no origin, no single tongue. And yet, across hundreds of miles, from cane field to cotton gin, it was spoken of in whispers as though it had always existed. They called it the Book of Ash, not a book in any conventional sense, but a scripture alive in pieces, scattered like the bones of a saint. Some said it was copied from the words Ezekiel once spoke before his crucifixion. Others believed it had been born from the cross itself, charred into the wood grain during the storm the night he vanished. None agreed on its contents. Some claimed it was prophecy, others, confession. But all who read it were changed, not in mind, but in memory. One man claimed that after reading a single page, he remembered the birth of a child he never fathered. A woman forgot the faces of her children, but spoke names no one recognized. A young boy read it aloud and spoke with the voice of an old man until he collapsed in the dirt, smiling. The pages were always warm. They resisted fire. Ink would not stain them. Water beat it off like oil. But blood sank in deep, darkening the surface until words appeared, and the words never repeated. Scholars from the north heard rumors and ventured south. Historians, linguists, missionaries, most never returned. The few who did carried scars and silence. One wrote a journal describing a passage that spoke of a harvest of marrow, of sermons written in smoke and buried in bone. He burned the journal 2 days later and drowned himself in a well. Copies circulated among the free black churches in secret, hidden beneath floorboards, etched into the backs of pews, whispered between verses of traditional hymns. But those who truly understood it never called it scripture. They called it testament. A record of what had happened, yes, but also a guide to what was coming. The book did not moralize, it did not soothe, it judged, and its judgment was unrelenting. Masters who came into possession of it found their households plagued. Milk turned to rot, walls bled from the seams, servants vanished or spoke in riddles. Some tried to destroy the fragments. They found that every page burned returned the next day in a different drawer, a different coat pocket, a different prayer book, always with more words than before. Each piece grew. It became clear that the Book of Ash was not a creation. It was a remnant, a record of a memory too old to fade, too painful to rest, a memory of a man nailed to a cross for speaking the truth, and of what rose from that silence. Even those who denied the supernatural began to fear it. Because it did not demand belief, it only required acknowledgement. Slaves began to gather in circles, not to preach, but to recite, not aloud, but in hums, in pulses, in breath shared in rhythm. Pages were passed hand to hand, never more than once. Some were hidden in the lining of clothes, others buried with the dead. Those who read were never the same, and those who tried to forget found the pages returning in dreams. Harrow's name appeared once, only once, in a copy found years later, far north, buried beneath the floor of a church that had never known slavery. It read, "He who crucified shall bear the sermon's end." No one could say who wrote it, but the ink had been mixed with ash and bone. There are places in the South where the trees do not sway, no matter how strong the wind, places where the soil is darker, where the air thickens just past the edge of the field, where the birds go silent mid-flight, places that do not appear on maps, but which every old soul knows to avoid, places where something once suffered so deeply that time refused to pass through. These are the places where he walks, not always seen, rarely heard, but felt in the shift of shadow, in the weight of silence, in the sudden chill that wraps around the neck like rope. He does not haunt, he does not chase, he waits. And those who carry the memory of the cross feel the pull. They are few now. Most who witnessed Ezekiel's crucifixion are long buried, but some lived long enough to regret, long enough to wonder, long enough to watch the world twist around what they once called justice. They moved far away, changed names, denied their part, but the cross is not a name. It is a mark. It follows. There are stories of men waking to find crosses drawn in salt across their floorboards, nails arranged at the foot of their beds, children speaking in voices that do not belong to them, whispering sermons in their sleep, cattle stillborn with cords wrapped like nooses, a bell tolling once, and only once, at midnight, though no church stood within miles. One by one, they vanish, not violently, not in spectacle, just gone. A chair pulled back from a table, a coat still hanging, a candle burnt to the bottom, and on the wall, carved so shallow it barely casts a shadow. He is walking. In New York, a professor found a page of the Book of Ash tucked into the spine of a Bible donated to a seminary. He read it aloud during a lecture. 3 students fainted. One began to speak fluent Gula, despite never hearing the language. The professor never spoke again. In Georgia, a plantation house turned museum was shut down after visitors complained of voices coming from the chapel. A tour guide found the crucifix missing from the wall. In its place was a bundle of twine, bent into the shape of a man, with a nail through its chest. But it is not vengeance. It is not rage. It is something deeper, older. A reckoning that moves without sound, without mercy, without end. It does not distinguish between guilt and complicity. It weighs only memory, and it finds everyone who watched and said nothing. They say he appears to the living only once. You will know it when it happens. A shadow cast with no body, a reflection that does not match your movements, a prayer that catches in your throat and will not leave. Then the sound, the first sound ever heard after his silence, the dragging of chains. And then, if you turn your head, you may see him, arms wide, feet bare, chest pierced, walking slowly toward nothing, and yet toward you. You cannot run, you cannot plead, you can only answer. And the question is always the same. When the nail was driven, did you bow your head? If you did, he passes by. If you did not, he raises his arms. And then, in perfect silence, you learn what it means to be remembered.